Ja idę tam w takim razie.
A nie wiedzieć, co powiesz.
Aha, dobra.
Dobra, jesteśmy na żywo, więc możesz opowiadać, a ja później może prezentację. So don't worry about the presentation, I'm going to put it on like once you
Start.
Yeah.
All right, so our final talk today to all the onliners, offliners. Here with us is Gabriel Levy, who is going to talk about cognitive gadgets, religion and enaction, so about integrating approaches to the study of religious minds. Gabriel is here with us coming from Norway, from Trondheim, where he is a professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Also, he is a chairperson of the Norwegian PhD Research School, Authoritative Texts and the Reception in Oslo, and he has recently published a monograph with MIT Press entitled Beyond Heaven and Earth, a Cognitive Theory of Religion. So thank you very much, Gabriel, that you are with us, and the floor is yours.
So first, thanks Tilda and Peter for a great conference so far. So I guess I'm the only keynote who is actually working on texts, and I actually prepared a text that I'm working on. So I appreciate any feedback I can get. I also have slides, but I'm going to read through quite a bit of this. So should I start this? Okay, how do I do that?
Okay, we will have to switch the, just a second. Because it's somewhere in the.
And it goes. It actually works. I can't see what's on the slides, but
yeah, that's it. But this is not. It should be.
Oh yeah. No. Maybe go back to this one. That's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Excellent.
Yes. So in the talk today, I'm gonna briefly go over this new theory. It's not that new, 2018, of cognitive gadgets from Cecilia Heyes. And then I'm gonna kind of try to think about how the cognitive gadgets theory accounts for the main traditional mechanisms that CSR uses to explain religion. I'll focus mostly, I'll use Claire White's book, which I think is quite clear about all of this stuff, to do that, and mainly focus on mentalizing or theory of mind as a central concept. The basic argument is that religion should be understood as a compound cognitive gadget that arises from domain general cognition, or what Heyes calls the starter kit, and cultural learning. And then she argues, well, the argument is that there are no domain-specific mechanisms innate to the human genome are necessary for religion to emerge. And then I'll move from that on into an intervention from enactive cognition, and finally touch a little bit on how this may or may not relate to the topic of religion and fiction. So on to the first one. So please correct me if you think I'm wrong, but in general, I think cognitive and evolutionary sciences of religion have gradually moved on from the models of early evolutionary psychology. Those models tended to argue that religious cognition is based on mental modules that are domain-specific and innate, evolving at some point among hominins to solve problems related to survival and reproduction. They moved on to an idea made popular by Robert Macaulay, the idea that much or most of religious cognition is maturationally natural. Maturationally natural is a way to have your cake and eat it too. It basically says that given the right conditions of maturation, something like a domain-specific area of cognition will emerge. With enough practice, other more complicated aspects of religious cognition can emerge, and Macaulay calls this practiced naturalness. So how is the cognitive gadgets model different? The difference we will see is big. Maturationally natural cognition, so the story goes, requires little instruction, is quick, automatic, and implicit. So this is still a version of innateness. If Oxford professor of psychology Cecilia Heyes is right, most of the cognition we designate as maturationally natural is actually cognitive technologies that need to be learned. Heyes gives us some useful tools to see where we may have overlooked just how much instruction is required. She calls her approach cultural evolutionary psychology. So personally, I've been shocked CSR people haven't engaged with Heyes more because the implications are pretty profound, I think, for the evolution of religion. The reason is probably because I think it challenges some of the core assumptions. To put the argument as simply as possible, it is that associative cultural learning gets us a lot further than we ever thought. More specifically, the argument, the same slide, more specifically, the argument is that human cognition is the result of processes that have taken place mostly outside of the head, not due directly to genetic inheritance and not due to nurturing parents alone, but rather to cultural inheritance. Since these processes are not inherited through our biology, they are more vulnerable to be lost. But also for this reason, it is wrong to think of humans as modern people with Stone Age minds. Our minds are partly cultural, which means new technology can be part of them. And though she doesn't discuss it, I think it's clear that religion should be an important piece of this puzzle as part of that cultural tradition. So two key questions in the research are about learning and about selection. If religion is a communal system of rituals and beliefs, we can ask the historical question when it started. Then we can ask the question about how it spread and how it persists. We are talking about tens of thousands of years of genetic and cultural evolution. Cultural evolutionary arguments can address how it originates and spreads, and Hayes's cultural evolutionary psychology gives us even more tools for thinking about this. The argument that Heyes puts forward, she puts focus on what she calls the big special psychological attributes. Abilities like language, theory of mind, imitation, episodic memory, self-conception, etc. These have typically been understood basically as modules in human cognition. They arise innately, automatically, or if you want to have your cake and eat it too, like Macaulay, in a kind of maturationally natural way. Hayes' project is to go through these and basically deconstruct them from a cognitive perspective, to paint a picture of how these abilities could arise through domain general learning passed on culturally. In this respect, human beings are not that unique, not that different from other animals, especially mammals and primates. She describes the differences in terms of tweaking or souping up, so not a strong qualitative difference. In other words, quote, in many cases, distinctively human ways of thinking are not as brand new and shiny as we thought. They are made of old parts and therefore tweaking by genetic evolution rather than heavy lifting would be enough to get their development going. She's not a blank slate culture-only theorist, and for me, this is why her work is so useful. human beings do have a unique biology. We do have genetic inheritance that makes our cognition special. But her model I would tend to describe as a minimalist model of the differences. So what does differentiate us from other animals? It's what she calls the starter kit. We are very much like primates and some mammals as far as cognition is concerned, except some aspects of our biology are souped up or tweaked, as she says, in 3 specific ways, with regard to temperament, attentional biases, and uniquely powerful central processors that basically allow for an unprecedented level of associative learning. This souped up ability to learn is, for Heyes, I think, what really differentiates human beings from other animals. I'll get back to the starter kit, but it's important for you to see the broad outline right away as part of an introduction. So to reiterate, the basic argument is that the abilities that cognitive science tended to see as arising from innate mechanisms of human cognition might be better explained as arising from a biologically more basic and minimal framework of the uniqueness of human cognition, coupled with a souped-up cultural learning ability. And Heyes argues for an interesting analogy or proof of principle in the domain of literacy. So reading and writing are distinctively human abilities. Indeed, neuroscientists have found the manner in which literacy is localized in the brain. On paper, it looks like a candidate for something that is maturationally natural, with a dedicated domain-specific module. Like mind reading or mentalizing, it appears thus to have neural specialization and associated developmental disorders like dyslexia. But literacy is prima facie obviously not that, according to Heyes. Literacy only arose relatively recently in human history, and there simply wouldn't be enough time for an innate biological model like that to develop. So, oh yeah. So as Heyes says, quote, first, reading is an immensely powerful and distinctively human form of cultural learning, a cognitive process that enables those who are literate to access a huge store of information acquired by previous generations. Second, it is clear that reading has been made possible by cultural evolution. Written language only emerged 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, unquote. So these images behind me are not from Heyes, but from previous sources, in particular, Denise Schment-Basseret's groundbreaking work on the origins of literacy in Asia, which in previous work I've used to discuss the connection between literacy and mentalizing or theory of mind. Indeed, literacy is something that gradually develops, evolving culturally over time. We find evidence for a kind of ratcheting effect in the early story of writing from about 8,000 to 3,000 BCE. In the proto-stage, human beings sculpted figurines representing various gods and animals for ritual purpose. Subsequently, notches were used to account for things like time, indicating a primitive relation between inscription and numerosity. In the next stage, tokens of basic geometric shapes representing simple food staples were made out of baked clay. Next, more complex tokens emerged that represent complex staples. And eventually, the tokens were imprinted on the clay, and the tokens themselves were no longer necessary. And finally, a big step was when these symbols were used to represent syllables and sounds from spoken language, eventually leading to the invention of the alphabet. But needless, perhaps, to say, this development is based almost entirely on tradition and cultural learning. No dedicated cognitive model was ever necessary. I'm curious what people think of this as a proof of principle. And wait till the end, there's a little more on this, but Cecilia Heyes thinks this is kind of a proof of principle of her basic argument. What at first glance might appear like a complex human ability with dedicated neurophysiology and cognitive architecture might on second glance be the result of a more basic human cognition coupled with cultural learning. In this sense, Heyes is overturning the cart of evolutionary psychology, or what she calls, quote, high church evolutionary psychology. Human cognition is inherently flexible and not a static product of the Pleistocene. There's so much more to say as far as a basic introduction to Heyes, but I think I have to move on and give you some examples rather than keep the generalities. Unfortunately, this means I obviously can't go into all the details of her broader argument. So, contra high church evolutionary psychology. Biological evolution doesn't drive those, quote, big special cognitive mechanisms I mentioned, such as theory of mind, imitation, causal understanding, self-conception, selective social learning, and in her most speculative chapter, even language she's trying to put in this framework. We don't have, quote, blueprint programs or blueprints for the development of powerful cognitive mechanisms that are qualitatively different from those found in other animals. Instead, we have a domain general souped up starter kit and culture. We genetically inherit a, quote, small ordinary psychology that gains most of its power from domain general processes of cultural learning. As far as this starter kit, the differences with other animals are small but important. Without them, we couldn't get those big special abilities because most of them, in fact, are rather useful in teacher-learner interactions. The small built-in differences are shown briefly on this slide. So first, we differ in temperament from most other primates. We seem to have domesticated ourselves to the point where we can tolerate one another in the context of social interactions, and perhaps even more importantly, we are emotionally motivated to do so. Second, we have built-in attentional biases, paying much more attention to faces and voices compared to other primates. And last, a kind of grab bag category Heyes calls uniquely powerful central processors that give us an enhanced capacity for associative learning. Such a capacity is, quote, unlikely to have been favored by genetic evolution for just one reason. This power also enhances, quote, executive functioning, specifically in the areas of inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. Heyes argues, and I think pretty convincingly, that once these small changes are available, when they are coupled with cumulative cultural learning, we have all we need for the development of the big special abilities. And I should also note here that since human beings all share this starter kit, there is still the potential for universals to develop. So she goes through 4 of these, 4 kind of examples of cognitive gadgets. All of these are important, I think, for understanding the evolution and development of religion. The first, selective social learning, is perhaps the most important because that's the engine that drives the other gadgets. So social selective learning exists in all animals, selective social learning. All animals learn. They, quote, encode information for long-term storage by forging excitatory and inhibitory links between event representations, end quote. But for humans, this capacity is souped up. Human learning is special in that in humans and only in humans, social learning is occasionally made selective by rules applied at the output stage, by what he calls explicitly metacognitive social learning strategies. The big one being, or one of the main ones, who knows? Explicit metacognitive social learning strategies, like other metacognitive rules, are learned from other people. They are cognitive gadgets. For some examples of explicitly metacognitive social learning strategies, she offers copy the boat builder with the largest fleet, or copy digital natives. These top-down rules are cook-like rather than planetary. The latter is the type of domain general learning found in other species. The former is more rare, a type of learning involving domain-specific top-down rules or recipes, and found only in humans thus far. These learning strategies are more likely cultural than genetic and promote cultural evolution. So regarding imitation, the basic argument is that we're not born imitators. Imitation, for example, imitating a jaguar, is something we learn how to do over the course of development and are explicitly taught how to do it. The famous studies conducted by Meltzoff and Moore in the 70s that seem to show an innate propensity to imitate have not been replicated, except perhaps in the case of smiling, or have horrid experimental artifacts. So the ability to imitate instead is possible through cultural specific associative sequence learning, by doing an action or seeing an action and then learning the association. Sometimes the learning is opaque, as in this slide here, and this is known as the correspondence problem. So oftentimes when we're imitating, we can observe ourselves in the process of imitation, but sometimes we can't actually see what we're doing, and this is known as the correspondence problem. And she argues that here the learning happens through sociocultural experience. For example, parents imitating a baby. In other words, we learn to imitate through cultural specific forms of synchronous action, where corresponding vertical associations, that's in this slide. Corresponding vertical associations are learned in simple cases through self-observation. Activation of the motor representation contributes to the performance of the action. For example, flattening of the hand. The baby observing itself, flattening the hand. And observation of the performed action producing correlative activation of a corresponding visual representation. So we can actually form a link, a representational link between these two. There are other ways. Interestingly, Heyes brings up a technology that helps solve the correspondence problem and has only recently been invented relative to the scope of human history, and is also the source of myth and legend, such as the story of Narcissus, and that is optical mirrors. But we also learn these matching vertical associations in being imitated by others and synchronous activity. She gives some examples, ritual among them. Such actions, quote, that enable group members to bond, to achieve the states of trust and a commitment required for cooperative action through the expression of common religious beliefs and the sharing of heightened states of arousal. Finally, we have mind reading or mentalizing. This topic is especially important for our purposes because it has been one of the central mechanisms for explaining religion since CSR first came on the scene. Robust forms of mind reading, she argues, are not innate, but rather taught, quote, taught in much the same way as print reading, through scaffolding and explicit instruction. And here she notes some differences with regard to the way the research is conducted, noting in the United States, scientists are more likely to see mind reading as a solitary innate achievement rather than a collective learned one. We learn how to mind read through social interaction. We are not born with the ability. And it is also wrong to think of it as maturationally natural. That idea puts the miracle of mind reading still at the innate level. In other words, all we need is the right environment and the innate blueprint will do the rest. Instead, the miracle is actually in the cultural environment and learning how to do it. So, like all these chapters, Heyes gives a detailed account that I can only touch on, so I encourage everyone to read the book yourself. She's also not thinking much about religion at all, so it's basically up to us to do that work. The argument, as in the other chapters, is that mentalizing is a learned cultural, or as she says, a collective achievement, not an innate individual one. So the roots of CSR, as we see in Claire White's wonderfully clear introduction to the field, are heavily indebted to the Swiss Army knife metaphor of human psychology. The different tools in the knife evolved to solve evolutionary problems in the past. The tools are themselves biological, innate, domain-specific adaptations. The adaptations, when coupled together like Legos or building blocks, can lead to something like religion. So White refers to these as cognitive foundations at the base of religion. And there are different mixtures or combinations of each of these foundations in religion. And mind reading, here referred to in Guthrie's terms as anthropomorphism, is one of them. I think something like a cognitive gadgets approach can probably be applied to each of these foundations, thus seriously challenging the broad architecture of CSR. It won't mean that the years of theorizing and experimentation are all in vain, but it will mean that the foundations arise from cultural learning rather than innate cognitive mechanisms. So a similar idea could be applied to other foundations, even the idea of intuitiveness or counterintuitiveness. They could also be learned. So we do not have cognitive templates or ontological categories that are innate and inborn. Rather, we learn them. With regard to agency detection itself, in Heyes, this is likely part of the starter kit and something we share with most other species. But I'm open to other suggestions. So here I would like to take the example of mind reading from the field to see how it functions as an explanation. It is meant as an example of a cognitive foundation. Basically, it's maturationally natural, coming automatically and without reflection, generating a number of assumptions about gods, namely they have, quote, mental states such as beliefs, desires, and intentions. This is from White, one of her examples. And what is the evolutionary background of this foundation? Foundations like these were biological adaptations to solve specific human-centric problems. They have nothing to do with culture. And I think this is a typical argument we see in CSR. If Heyes is right, we have to rethink the so-called evolutionary origins of religion. So as far as religion is concerned, I think a coherent argument that says mentalizing is learned rather than built in has dramatic consequences for our understanding of evolution and the development of religion. Importantly, it gives a strong case to the argument that religion is learned, not innate. Religion is a byproduct of a cultural adaptation, namely mentalizing, which is itself built on the small, ordinary biological adaptations. I think one further important consequence of this conceptual shift will mean we have to start paying much closer attention to the content of religion. The content is a crucial part of the gadget. Without the content, the gadget won't work. The content is the vehicle for much of the social learning. There is also the question of whether some conception of religion or some definition of religion would make sense to apply at the level of the starter kit. In my own work, I've called this religion 1, like subscript 1, But what we typically understand as religion makes more sense as what Heyes calls a compound cognitive gadget, a term I found Heyes using in the Target article about the book in BBS, which she says applies to autobiographical memory. Autobiographical memory is a compound cognitive gadget, but I think it equally applies to religion. So all gadgets are compounds. This is a quote from that. All gadgets are compounds in that, like any complex cognitive mechanism, they incorporate many subroutines. But some gadgets are compounds in a deeper sense. They're combinations of other gadgets. So I'm going to move on here now to the final part of the talk. The question of whether we need an intervention from enactive cognition on Heyes's model. And then the implications of that for the question about religion and fiction. So I hope you all get the sense that Heyes's version of human cognition is pretty well in line with the extended and embedded versions of cognition. Basically, human cognition is what it is because it takes place outside the head. I think there's plenty in Heyes that is conducive not just to 3E cognition, but also the 4th E, enactive approaches to cognition. Specifically, both share a minimalist method and a micro-pragmatic approach. To the extent that it is conducive, it may ride partly on the question of what role representations play in the model. One of the most enduring aspects of enactive approaches is that it is a way to study human cognition without an over-reliance on representations. Though some enactivists are not completely anti-representational, there's a spectrum, but I would say it leans on the anti-representationalist side. So in their excellent summary article, quote, Horizons of the Enactive Mind from 2010, DePaulo, Rode, and de Jager discuss a number of important concepts from enactive cognition. But for our purposes, I think the discussion of value is most important, also as it relates to signals, because without value, signals can't actually carry information, so the argument would go. So their question is, where does value come from? For an activist, we need to be skeptical of the idea that values come built into organisms. They describe a kind of ascending nature of value based on the activity of the whole organism. There is one, what I would call, transcendental value that they need to posit, which flows around the notion of autopoiesis. For these authors define value as, quote, the extent to which a situation affects the viability of a self-sustaining and precarious network of processes that generate identity. Basically, life we're talking about. So different types of identity arise out of various stages of emergence depicted in this image above along these two axes. An axis of increasing autonomy and one of increasing immediacy. To have value in the sense that we usually mean it, organisms need to be adaptive autopoietic systems, meaning they try to improve their conditions for continuing autopoiesis. Adaptivity brings the first level in which we can start to understand sense-making. But you can have adaptivity without agency. This would be a, quote, just adaptive organism, such as a sulfur bacterium that lives anaerobically in marine sediments. An organism that acts on its environment is said to have agency, moving up, or in this case, down the ladder. Mediacy is meant in the sense, I think, of an immediate versus distantly mediated relation to basic metabolism, like the organism keeping itself alive energetically. And as more and more distance, you have more and more mediation between these things, it creates more and more possibility for signs that can be acted upon. For humans, the culmination of this comes in image making and then self-image. So the last one, where we, quote, gain the ability to regard situations objectively and define ourselves as subjects, to distinguish truth from falsehood, and to experience happiness and frustration. As an illustration meant to differentiate the enactive approach from a functionalist, nativist theories of value, they provide this illustration. For an activist, values are not primordial or one-dimensional, but dynamic and emergent. They do not tend to separate value judgment from value execution. And here I think we can see some clear connection to Heyes, even if she does not consider herself an enactivist. The frameworks seem to work nicely together. For both, values are not pre-programmed and inbuilt in the organism, but arise through a more dynamical process. In Hayes's model of associative learning, which often occurs through imitation, which is the bedrock of the theory, performance of synchronous actions such as ritual can create excitatory and inhibitory links between representations of events, as here between sensory and motor events, where the red line would be the representation, I suppose. She says these event representations are lean. So in other words, the connection, if you want to put it that way, between moving the hand and seeing the hand move. But she calls these lean representations, Heyes does. So with regard to representations, a lot depends on what she means by this term lean. She means those representations are, quote, merely sensory motor images of the events themselves. And it is at times unclear whether perception and cognition are, quote, construed as distinct processes. So there's some unclarity in Heyes whether she consider these distinct processes, perception and cognition. I'm not going to say too much more about this, but to the extent that such lean representations are detached from the autonomy and immediacy of the whole organism, we can say that they begin to edge back towards a more functionalist, representationalist language, and we might not need that. But this opens up some bigger questions about the role of representations in religion. I think especially enactive approaches to cognition are going to become increasingly popular among scholars of religion. Surprisingly, very few have taken it up yet, with, as far as I can see, Tilda being the first and only. And in my book, I use concepts from, in the most recent book, Enactive Cognition, I use as an aid to fill gaps left open in Davidsonian accounts of religion. So Davidson is known as a post-analytic philosopher or logical pragmatist, and pragmatism and enactive cognition share a lot in common, namely that the focus is on action rather than representations. The evolutionary theorist of religion, John Tehan, is also working on an enactive approach to religion that should see the light of day soon. John thinks enactive approaches are more conducive than previous approaches to the evolutionary accounts of religion. Enactive approaches to cognition, including the free energy principle, provide a better model than representational ones like predictive processing, because these have to posit representations as a kind of deus ex machina. In other words, there is an explanatory gap concerning the origin, and I would say even the metaphysics of the postulated representations. So representation is a big issue here, and I'm sort of poaching this question based on seeing a review to a large project on enactive approaches to religion. where the reviewer was skeptical of the idea of a non-representational or anti-representational approach to religion, quote, because everyone knows religion is all about representations. So the big question is, can an anti-representationalist approach account for religion? Part of the problem is the very assumption that religious ideas are highly representational. So in my own work, I've used Donald Davidson to approach this question. Davidson may have solved an even tougher problem with regard to whether we need a concept of representation to account for semantics and meaning. So I think this is why a number of scholars in the study of religion have taken up his work. That is, if we can account for meaning or propositional content without representations, surely we can account for religion without them. We, of course, cannot deny that a statue of the Buddha, decorations on a Torah scroll, or paintings in the Sistine Chapel are representations. Those are not the type of representations we take issue with. Our gripe is with the claim that representations are in the head, or in Davidson's terms, that they serve as semantic or even epistemic intermediaries. Religious ideas are not representations in the head because ideas aren't in the head. If you think they are, please show them to me in the head. Of course, there is memory, there's some kind of storage, some kind of links, relations, and associations between objects and events. So now we come to the most controversial part, I think, and perhaps most in line with Tanya Luhrmann's work. To solve the problem of representation, we need to account for the nature of information. To cut right to the point, for Davidson, information, if we want to call it that, is intersubjective. Subjectivity and objectivity are dependent on this primary intersubjectivity. And this is true of basic forms of cognition and complex forms. The core aspects of Davidson are holism coupled with a strict behavioral psychology with a few transcendentals that he thinks he needs to get the system kind of off the ground. But really, I think these two quotations are most important for making sense of it, religion from this perspective. So the idea that the unit of interpretation is one's total behavior, and that meaning depends on successful interpretation rather than the other way around. For Davidson, the content of meaning, if we want to call it that, is emergent in the interaction. It's always situational. In order to understand this, Davidson uses the model of triangulation. When language is taken out of the situation, it no longer makes sense. It becomes a kind of fiction. Triangulation is necessary for the emergence of thought, but it is not sufficient. For Davidson, what is needed is language. And by language, he basically means these four conditions. You need to have a concept of truth, a concept of names and predicates, truth functional connectives like and, not, if, or then, and quantification. So though it hasn't been done, I suggest in my book that these four conditions could perhaps be accounted for as cognitive gadgets. So Davidson here does not mean big capital T truth, but little t truth. That is, we learn to use the word, the concept of truth, by watching others apply it. So aside from this minimal apparatus, the rest of complex semantic content comes from learning and the environment. We learn to use the concept of truth inevitably in situations that could metaphorically be understood as a correspondence pump and a coherence pump. Davidson was famously critical of correspondence theories of truth. More precisely, we could say that he was critical of representationalist models that saw language as a mirror of nature or the world. As we see, in triangulation, truth does not map one-to-one correspondences with the world, but is rather filtered through a kind of prism of social interaction. That is the nature of the truth and indeed falsity. That is the nature of truth and indeed falsity, so there is no point trying to extricate from it. We learn how truth and indeed falsity is applied in context of correspondence. Similarly, we learn how to use the concepts in terms of their consistency with other things we are taught to regard as true and false. In other words, coherence. For Davidson, this does not lead to relativism. And this, I won't go down into that rabbit hole now. But anyway, we have these two pumps, a coherence pump, which you can think of maybe the media, or a better example might be like ChatGPT, which basically just copies and learns from things people have said and has no way of checking itself. So it kind of stuck at the level of coherence, at least for now. And we have a correspondence pump, think ostension or testing. Ironically, I think flat earther conspiracies are a good example of that. So flat earthers don't believe anything anyone tells them. They only trust what they see in front of them. And the earth looks flat. So ironically, this maniacal allegiance to correspondence leads to falsity and absurdity. So the concepts of truth and falsity are a mix of correspondence and coherence and cannot be unmixed. Davidson famously focused on truth, but we can equally say that these are falsity pumps. We can't have truths without falsities. If all of us pushing a Davidsonian approach are right, he provides an account of semantic content without reliance on representations. Indeed, even the concept of truth is not representational in Davidson, but deflationary. So what does that mean for religious representations, getting back to Heyes? The point is, we don't need a genetically predetermined, domain-specific cognitive machinery to account for the foundations of religion. We can get by with the minimalist framework of the starter kit. The challenge is then making sense of the foundations through processes of triangular learning in cultural institutions, or in Heyes's framework, cognitive gadgets that take work to persist and could easily be lost. But part of what makes cognitive gadgets possible in the first place is also the generative foundation of religion, namely learning through the fictions of correspondence and coherence. From this perspective, religion is a combination or compound of a series of cognitive gadgets. Once the gadget is there, it is as if it is real. The best example of this is none other than mind reading or mentalizing. The gadget is built, it's ficted, that's not really a word, but it's ficted, and once there, it takes on a life of its own. I think something like the same thing takes place with regard to fictional agents in religion. The mind is just as much a fiction as these agents are. So religious representations are figments of the imagination, both for so-called believers and for scholars, but we still nevertheless interact with these fictions. Another way to put this is that the cognitive gadgets are fictions. In other words, they are built up, learned, and take work to maintain. But human cognition would not work without them. And the same applies to religion, I think. We can't get rid of fictions without getting rid of human cognition. And we similarly cannot get rid of religious fictions. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Gabriel. And now we have time for questions and comments. Ben, please.
Yours is more regard to the first half of the talk about.
Are you not going to come up here?
Yeah.
Everybody else got
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
I forgot about this cue.
You don't have a chair.
Thank you, sir.
I was curious about your take on like the poverty stimulus argument. You know, not in linguistics specifically, but more in line with the cultural domains. The idea that the environment we are born into does not provide enough information for us to reproduce this stuff to the full, like whether it's a gadget or whatever, to the fullest extent. So like in Chomsky's argument, on language, like there's so much going on internally that we can't possibly have learned externally. So like, how does this fare with this?
She Hayes talks about that, and so she is challenging that model, but she also accepts that there can be poverty of stimulus or a wealth of stimulus, and she uses that basically as to test her theory. So she's basically trying to kind of flip the script and basically say that there's more of a wealth of stimulus in these cases than we usually think, and she's pointing to them like experimentally and using evidence, basically an argument to point at them and saying we missed them, basically. We've kind of overlooked them. She doesn't deny that there might be some mechanisms where there's a poverty of stimulus that are more likely to be kind of innate or something like that. But she definitely thinks something like theory of mind doesn't involve a poverty of stimulus.
Right. What's interesting with respect to gods, because there's no stimulus. It's just other people's words, right? But the kinds of inferences, I don't want to necessarily say they're innate, but like the kinds of inferences that people make about gods, like that they're not talking about, it seems compelling. It's not the rejection of psychology, but is this the kind of stuff that holds these items, these gadgets together almost?
Well,
the inferences.
Yeah, but I don't. So is it? I mean, I guess you would say a big part of inferences, we learn how to make inferences. So from the people around us. So we're not born with inferences, I guess would be the argument there. But thanks.
Yes, please, can you talk?
Thanks, Gabe. Can we just go back to the other slide you had before, where you had, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't think I ever really understood Cecilia Heyes' perspective. So I think I feel it, I understand a little bit better now. So
Okay, great.
I think I just wonder how novel her perspective is if you contrast it with what we would also call cultural evolution. So Boyd and Richardson's perspective and their students, right?
Yeah.
So I think, at least from this figure, they would probably posit another arrow.
Okay.
So going from cultural evolution back to genetic evolution, right?
Right.
Gene culture co-evolutionary perspective.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is that where they differ, or and if so, what's kind of the applications if you allow the arrow to go back to genetic evolution? Say, cultural evolution prepare us for prepares genetically for then learning better or paying attention to social cues and stuff like that. So is that two questions?
No, that's a great question. Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
And then what are the applications if that's kind
So
of different?
As I understand it, she sees herself as like fitting in with the different schools of cultural evolutionary psychology, and they're all very similar. And what the difference is that, or she claims the difference is that most of those assume more kind of machinery than she wants to at this more basic level. But I think she might be open to some feedback between the two if it was if it made sense. I mean, if there was evidence for it. But like as far as like the starter kit, that is that's a basic level, and I don't think she needs cultural learning. I mean, she really sees it as kind of the grounds for cultural learning too.
So cultural evolution couldn't shape the starter kit. And have you?
I don't know.
And in your view?
In my view, yeah. So I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, maybe
that would be the postulate from someone like Rich and Boyd and their students, right?
Yeah, I think. I think there would be nothing kind of running against this cognitive gadgets theory. Just think that there could be some feedback back to the genetic level.
Would change.
Probably not.
Interesting.
But yeah.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Conrad, are you raising your hand?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you are. You're finding more inconspicuous ways of.
No, it's just, I keep asking questions and I don't want to stop anybody else from.
Be proud of yourself.
All right, but
You're so effective.
okay, I mean, you started off by saying that people don't pay enough attention to Cecilia Heyes, right? And I agree with you, but we don't pay attention to most things, right? I mean, to a certain degree, it seems to me like science is impossible, right? The number of things that we absolutely must know is greater than the number of things that we possibly could know.
Yes.
Right. So, but I wanted to ask you about a couple of different things. First of all, and I'm sorry because this is going to be kind of philosophical, right? The coherence correspondence truth, right? It's actually a pragmatist argument that keeps me wedded to correspondence truth, right? And it's the one that comes from Peirce, right? Charles Sanders Peirce, right? One of the things he talks about, he calls secondness. But the way to describe it simply is the capacity for the world to hit us upside the head when we get things wrong, to surprise us, to do things that simply do not fit with our expectations, right? And keep doing that until we get our expectations right, right? So it's that kind of argument that really says to me, all right, we have to have correspondence truth to avoid secondness. Right? I'm wondering how you'd come back to that. So that's the first question I have. And the second one kind of runs in a very different direction, because listening to what you said and listening to I think the shortcomings of both the correspondence and the coherence side of things, really, I keep going back to the argumentative account of reason presented by Mercier and Sperber, right? Where I think the way they turn things around about how we should think about human reason, that human reason isn't primarily and originally to ascertain what is truth, but simply to convince the other person that they should follow your suggestions. That's a gross simplification that I'm giving right now. But that, I think, is a very useful observation to make sense of some of the things that you were saying and to, I think, make them sound more convincing to people.
Yeah.
But that's my intuition here. I'm wondering what your thought is.
Appreciate the comments about, actually you started with, so I agree that there's so much stuff that we have to read, but I just thought this seems so relevant.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, I guess a lot of things are relevant, but I find it.
I love Hayes' work. I don't pay enough attention to it myself.
Yeah. So, and I actually think there might be like experimental and analytic ways of using her argument like to do more research in the study of religion, like actually go through her arguments and rethink some of these foundations. But anyway, so then the correspondence point. I mean, so for Davidson, there is correspondence. Like he, like Peirce and, Dewey and William James, they're like all kind of, they're saying very similar things. And for Davidson, there is correspondence, but you kind of learn, you learn how to make correspondences by people showing you how to do it. Is kind of the argument about triangulation. So,
Okay.
and there is a debate in the field, in this small Davidsonian area of religion, about the role of like ostension. We learn one of the applications of truth when people show us things in the world that we can see and start applying language to it. Like those are the most basic cases of correspondence. So like if you think like with children, it's hard to speak kind of abstractly about things. Like you're more focused on like the here and now, like that's ostension. And whether that itself is primary is one of the questions. But Davidson doesn't, for Davidson, correspondence is important, but so is coherence is the point. And there's not like this, as I said, there's not a kind of one-to-one correspondence, and it wouldn't be in Peirce either, I don't think either, like between language and the world, so to speak.
At the final end of science, right? Which will never happen.
Which will never happen. But the coherence is also equally important, and that might relate to the Sperber stuff. I always like reading Sperber, but is it related to like the idea of like truth tracking as not like evolved?
Well, what Messier and Sperber are saying is that our ability to reason about arguments is to do with, it's to do with social learning, right? We get a lot of information from others, but we have to try and ascertain whether we should act on that information, right? So we have to be able to evaluate that information. But on the other hand, the people who are giving us the information obviously want us to act on the information. So they're trying to present us with reasons to act on that information, right? So you've got a sender-receiver kind of situation where there's a mismatch between their aims often, but the overall result is to develop argumentation. Where, of course, once you have argumentation, you can use it for all kinds of other aims, where if you have it specifically organized as it is in science, you can actually have it serving the task of trying to understand what the world is like.
So to me, it sounds like that has more to do with, in this way of thinking, coherence. Like
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
as I said, those two things I mentioned kind of coming from very different directions.
Yeah, but that might be a nice. That might be a nice other way to frame this, like Peircean secondness and Sperberian reason as like another way of saying something very similar. But I guess as far as religion is concerned, the issue is that basically religious ideas and beliefs are fully rational and part of our everyday reasoning. They might be false, like in this model, they can be false, but still rational. We have plenty of things that are false, but still rational. So yeah, I guess I didn't answer your question so much.
No, that's fine. Cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else? So I will.
I
question.
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of picking on words maybe, and so like returning to the question of representationalism or non-representationalism. I'm going to pick on something you said at the very end of your presentation. So you said that representation is in fact like it's imagination. So like I mean, it's maybe a very basic question, maybe too basic, but so how would you? So what is imagination if it's not representational?
Yeah, I think it's a really fair question. I liked what you said when someone basically asked you the same question at the beginning of this conference, and you were talking about concepts and stuff. Like maybe that at some level we just can't avoid talking about representation. But I think, like, if we take this Heyes approach, it's similar to like Hutto and these guys who basically want to say most of our cognition is not representational, and when it comes to more complex forms of cognition, we might need to start bringing in representations in some way. But I'm a little bit uncomfortable with it. I guess that's what this slide is about. Like we can't avoid, where is it? Maybe it's related to that. The more proper domain for thinking about representation is that they're external, that they're not in the head. And so even a concept is not a representation. It's like it's a shape of the body, of society, it's moving.
So it's like more interactional in a way.
It's
okay. Because there's also one thing that came to my mind relating with like maybe also kind of grasp the concept of imagination, but maybe the matter of like a second, I don't know, kind of second order kind of quality. So it's about maybe it's a bit of a loophole. I'm getting lost in it myself now, but anyway, not a loophole, but like whatever. You have, because probably we talk about representations because we have experience of representing things. Like, it seems to you, not for all people, but for probably most people, like they will experience having images in their heads, or whatever other, maybe non-visual, visual, I guess is the most common point of reference, but maybe other sensory modalities, and they like have the experience of stuff, I don't know, experiencing stuff in their head, right? So it's a question of, we don't have access, at least probably until now, into the head. So, but we have the access to the experience of, representing things. So maybe it's more like a, phenomenological thing.
Yeah, that might be a more accurate way to talk about it, because where are those representations in space or time? Where are they?
Okay, so I guess still no answers, right?
No.
Okay. Anybody else? Anything? Okay, so maybe we can wrap up for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Should I end the show?
I'm